What is up, my nerds? Nateinthewild here. Thank you so much for coming back. It's good to see you all. I missed you. Hopefully you missed me. It's been a little while, but guess what? I am back and I am here in my beautiful, brand new home office on the road. That's right, I bought a van, but don't you worry, this is not going to become a van life YouTube with Pendleton blankets and wide brim hats. This is going to stick to what we do best. Ultra nerdy camera talk. Let's get into it.
I got everything you need.
Okay, y'all, this is a big one today. This is by far one of the most requested comparisons I get on my social media channels. The Sony 20mm f1.8G, which, as you know, I am pretty much obsessed with, and the 24mm f1.4G Master, which, as you know, everybody is obsessed with. This is kind of a little bit of a battle of the titans here. These are two of the best wide-angle prime lenses in the Sony lineup. They are ridiculously sought after. I'm going to put them head-to-head. Let's see how they do. So right off the bat, let's get some of this nerdy stuff out of the way. Looking at the size, they are nearly identical looking. The 24mm is just a little bit bigger, but when I say a little bit, I mean seriously a little bit. The 20mm is 13.16 ounces and the 24mm is 15.7 ounces. So pretty similar again, a little bit heftier for the 24, but of course you have a wider aperture. That does mean more glass. There's only so much they can do about that. Now, as far as the optical performance, once again, very similar. The 20mm, of course, being a little bit wider, has a 94-degree field of view, and the 24mm is an 84-degree field of view. It's a little bit tighter, but you knew that from the name already. Minimum focusing distance again goes to the 20mm at a minimum focusing distance of just 7 inches. The 24mm has a minimum focusing distance of 9.45 inches, but of course slightly more magnification due to the focal length, so for all intents and purposes you're going to find those to be fairly similar as well. Now the aperture range is where we really start to get some difference. The 20mm, of course, wide open is f1.8. It stops down all the way to f22. The 24mm opens up all the way to f1.4, but only stops down to f16. Now, if you find yourself spending a lot of time in the aperture ranges between f16 and f22, spoiler alert, you shouldn't be, then you'll probably want the 20mm because the 24 just simply does not go past 16. Beyond that, they're nearly identical. They both have a 67mm filter thread. They both feature a manual aperture ring that has both clicked and smooth turns. They both feature manual focus and autofocus selector switch with a focus ring. The construction feels nearly identical. They have a focus hold button. They look seriously the same, and to be honest, if you saw them in the field and they were not side by side for comparison's sake, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference unless you saw that one had an orange G and the other one did not. So let's start with some simple landscape photography. This is just a basic desert scene that I shot from one of my campsites the other day. So looking at these wide open, you can tell that the 20mm and the 24mm have pretty similar performance, except for, of course, that slight difference in the field of view. You lose a little bit of this composition with the 24. I'm not going to dock it points for that because that's really just situationally dependent. In some scenarios, 24 will be better. In other scenarios, the 20 will be. That's a decision only you can make, which one is going to benefit you more. The 20mm has a fairly serious vignette around it. It's nothing as bad as, say, the Voigtlander at 20mm or the Tokyo Firen at 20mm. I have a video detailing both of those on my channel, by the way, if you'd like to see those comparisons. After applying a little bit of the Lightroom lens correction, it's actually pretty nice. It looks really smooth corner to corner, and I don't see any weird optical anomalies on there that I would have any issues with. Same goes for the 24. I have a pretty decent vignette. Of course, f1.4 is ridiculously wide open, but again, the Lightroom correction pretty much takes care of that and leaves us with a beautiful, clean-looking image. I shot this same scene at different apertures so we could see how that vignette changes as we move down. I was kind of rushing around, so I shot these handheld, so they're not all flawlessly aligned. You'll have to forgive me for that, but I think the point will stand as far as looking at this vignette disappearing. As we stop down to 2.8, it's still there fairly seriously, but as we move towards f4 and f5.6, it lightens up a decent amount. Around f8, it seems to be pretty clean all the way across the frame, and then I stopped it all the way down to f22, and you can see that, again, here, it actually is we're starting to get that chroma and the vignette again, and it's a little bit less sharp in the corners, as would be expected with any lens that's stopped all the way down. Now with the 24, a pretty similar thing happens. The vignette disappears somewhat significantly from f1.4 to f2.8, and it kind of hangs around from f4 to 5.6. It fully disappears around f8, it seems, except for, you know, a pretty natural vignette that you get with almost every lens. And then at f11 it starts to come back, and at f16 you have a fairly serious vignette, somewhat soft performance. But again, this is a G-mastered lens, so it's pretty dang sharp and looks really optically great through all of the aperture ranges. And realistically, that might be part of why it stops at 16. It's because Sony knew that if they continued the aperture from f16 to f22, that they wouldn't be able to get it looking as sharp enough to earn the G-Master badge. So maybe they are like literally the exact same lens, but Sony just stopped the aperture at f16 to kind of sneak that weird chromatic performance in the upper aperture ranges under the radar. So obviously what always gets everybody's knickers in a bunch when you talk about these two lenses is the Astro performance. I would say 80% of the questions I get are which one is in my bag for astrophotography. So I stepped out later that night around 1 in the morning to take some Astro shots, and let's take a look at those. Now, I reviewed both of these lenses' Astro performances in separate videos. The 20 has a standalone where I do astrophotography and aurora borealis, and then the 24mm is compared to two other wide-angle primes in astrophotography specifically. But I've never done a head-to-head to these, so I shot these on the same tripod, same settings, same conditions, so we can do an identical head-to-head battle between them. The 20mm here at f1.8, of course, looks pretty dang good. This is at ISO 4000, f1.8, and a 15-second exposure. We had no moon that night, so it was extremely dark, which is why those settings might sound pretty extreme to some of you. Zooming in, you can see there's actually a tiny bit of star trails. You'll have to forgive me for that. The 500 rule is not always perfect, and when you have a super high-resolution camera like the A7R anything series, you're going to see star trails even at what should be considered reasonable exposure times. That said, we can see that it is a very sharp lens. The stars themselves are focused down to single pixels, more or less. There's a little bit of spherical aberration around the brighter stars. They sort of glow a little bit more than you would want. That could be an exposure issue because those stars are so much brighter than the darker stars, which are what I was trying to properly expose for. And I'm not really going to dock it for that because unless you're printing these 40 by 60 in a gallery and somebody's standing 4 inches away, I doubt they're going to pick up on something like that. In fact, the larger stars and planets having that glow around them, to me, adds kind of a fun artistic depth to the field. You can see that we have a decently heavy vignette around the tops and the bottom again, nothing that I really dislike. And again, the Lightroom built-in profile correction does a great job of flattening that out for the sky, but you end up with a ridiculously noisy image down in the lower corners. I don't like it. I'm going to leave it on because I don't think a little vignette on a night sky photo hurts anything. If we zoom into these upper corners, however, you can see there is a tiny bit of astigmatism. There's some wings on these stars. They're a little bit bigger and a little more stretched out than I would want. It's not what I'm going to say is a huge deal, but it's not necessarily flawless. That said, I've never seen a flawless lens. I'm going to continue saying that I love this one. There's also a little bit of barrel distortion. You can see how up in the corner here, these stars have streaks, but not necessarily the direction of the motion. They're kind of stretched in more or less sort of a circular pattern, which is, you know, sort of warping an image into a circular shape around it. And that's something that you find a lot in super wide aperture prime lenses. Moving over to the 24, of course, it's a slightly different focal length, and there's kind of nothing we can do about that, so these images aren't exactly identical, but they're good enough for comparison's sake. This one, because I was able to shoot it at f1.4, I actually only did a 10-second exposure to keep the exposure proper. Zooming in on it, you can see, again, it's just astoundingly sharp. Everyone knows that. Everyone's talked about it. I'm not doing any groundbreaking research here. A little bit of the same stuff. These brighter stars don't glow quite as much, so you have to give the leg up to the 24mm on that. The spherical aberration is much lower. A little more chromatic aberration as you see these stars here, a little bit more magenta in the center of the Milky Way area, which is not quite as pronounced on the 20, and it is significantly more pronounced on the 24. Take it or leave it if that's something that bothers you. Some people, that's a deal breaker. For me, not a huge deal. Now, up in the corners here, pretty serious astigmatism. These wings look like these stars are ready to take off and just go zooming across the screen, and that chromatic aberration is significantly more noticeable. The magenta really starts to pop in those corners. I think it looks nice. It's at f1.4, so I'm a little bit forgiving on things like that. It's not perfect. There's nobody who can tell you it's perfect, but it's manageable. It's something that I don't really have a huge issue with. All in all, it's a very, very sharp lens at f1.4, which allows you to really take low light images with some low ISO, short exposures, and get nice, clean looking images. Now, one of the questions I got that I thought was pretty interesting was somebody who was curious about whether or not the bokeh was creamy on the 20mm versus the 24. And I have to admit, I'd never actually taken a macro photo with it, and I found that to be kind of a stumping question. So I went out, I took the 24mm, and I did a real nice close-up of this pine needle. There was a little bit of sap hanging off the end. I'm going to be honest with you, it's not the most interesting photo, but for the purposes of seeing how nice and soft the bokeh drop-off is, I think it does pretty well for that. You can see that the background is just like completely satin, which is beautiful. The pine needles down below here that are out of focus just smoothly drop off. Lower quality lenses, you'll notice that when the bokeh isn't super clean, you can actually like see sort of halos around things as they go out of focus. This lens doesn't have that. It is fantastic. All of these needles just basically drop off into infinity, and it's pretty impressive the way it's rendered. On the 20mm, we actually find a pretty similar thing. There's a little bit more in focus, of course, because it is an f1.8 lens instead of f1.4. We're shooting a little wider, etc. But the background bokeh, super clean, super soft. And again, the drop off on these closer pine needles seems really, really uniform and even. No halos, no ghosting, no echo effect around those. I'm going to have to say for the bokeh comparison, I'm finding these lenses pretty dang nice. There's obviously a little bit less bokeh for 1.8 versus f1.4. You know, there's going to be gives and takes on these lenses. They aren't meant to be the same, and so they aren't. I also shot a couple clips looking straight into the sun to show the lens flare and the ghosting that you get from that kind of thing. These both feature ultra low dispersion glass elements, so they're meant to have very little lens flare. And as you can see from these clips, there actually isn't much. As I move the camera back and forth a little bit, you can see there's some small green and pink lens flares, a little bit of sparkly there. It looks nice to me. It's not overbearing, but it's not completely non-existent. I personally love lens flares, so I would be pretty disappointed if there was none. But I understand from a technical perspective, Sony is striving to get these lenses as clean as possible because things like lens flares, etc. can be added in post. And before you come at me with like, it's weird to add lens flares in post, J.J. Abrams is basically a billionaire, so come at me, bro. Now, picking a distinct winner between these two, for me, is going to be really tough because they aren't meant to be head-to-head. They are two different lenses for two different purposes, and it's kind of impossible to say which one is going to suit your needs best. I personally like the 20mm because I shoot landscapes and astrophotography. I like wide angle, and f1.8 is plenty for me for what I do, but 24mm is a little bit limiting. Now, if you find yourself shooting street photography, cityscapes, architecture, some portraits, you might find the 24mm to be infinitely more appealing. It's going to be a little bit better for portraits. It's going to have less distortion, and it's going to make a nicer looking face. f1.4 will give you better bokeh. It's got a little bit cleaner lines. You're going to find it maybe not quite as useful for landscapes, not wide enough for certain scenarios, but when you're shooting portraits or street photography, etc., as I already discussed, you're going to find it much more versatile. That said, it is nearly twice the price of the 20mm, and that's going to be a deal breaker for some as well. Only you can really say which one won, but I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you own one of these? Both of these? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching. Again, as always, I am Nateinthewild. Thanks for stopping by and getting nerdy with me. Hope to see you all here next time. Ciao.